I'm going to be brutally honest with you. I doubt that I ever will watch it. I hate watching myself. I was a talking head on Ancestors TV series. They sent me, to show how long ago, I think it was videos they sent me, but I never watched one.
Welcome. We're going to do the declarations and the articles of faith, and we've asked our friend and special guest back for another session on this time frame and these things that he has spent a lot of research on, and we're really grateful for that.
And I'm super excited, Craig. Thank you. I know that you are somewhat of an expert on those events that led up to Declaration Number 1 and have quite a bit of background on Declaration Number 2 as well. You are the expert, and we're grateful to have you.
Good to be here.
And you can always find us at Prophetic Appointments. I'm Farrell.
And I'm Rhonda.
We're
and
the
we're
Pickerings. And we welcome Craig Foster. And with that, let's take it from there.
All right. Well, thank you. And thank you for asking me to be involved again. I wanted to talk about we'll start with official Declaration Number 1, the Manifesto, which was in 1890. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to explain what led up to the Manifesto. First of all, plural marriage was publicly introduced in the early 1850s, 1852, if I remember correctly. And of course, before that, there obviously had been rumors. However, the church did not officially announce that they were practicing plural marriage until that time. And so leading up to the Manifesto, you had the rest of the 1850s, you had the 1860s, and you had the 70s, and you had attempts to introduce anti-polygamy legislation. The Morel anti-bigamy law bill was made law in 1863, if I remember correctly. So there were attempts to, yes.
Okay, so Greg, you're talking about the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s. Flesh out these time periods for those of us that aren't as familiar with church history. So we're talking like Brigham Young, out in Salt Lake Valley. What are we doing?
Sorry. Okay. So during this time, up to 1877, Brigham Young was president of the church, and there were various newspaper articles, books that were written where people visited Salt Lake City. A lot of curious people coming to see the Mormons and the plural wives and all the children type things. So you had various writers talking about their visits to Salt Lake City and if they saw some polygamous wives, etc., and so forth. And that included even Mark Twain, who wrote some really rather humorous stories about when he came to Salt Lake City and visited Brigham Young. And so you had these attempts, but to try to stop polygamy, but more it was curiosity and everything. Then after the Civil War and into Reconstruction, so this would have been from 1865 into the mid-1870s, you had people talking out against plural marriage and saying something needs to be done about those Mormons in Utah with all their wives, etc., and so forth. But even though we had the Morel Anti-Bigamy Act of 1863, and we had an attempt in the 1870s to make it harsher, that not much was done until the 1880s.
So you would say that back east, there was quite a bit of bad press.
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
And there was quite a bit of hostility on the Senate floor.
There was hostility among the politicos in Congress. There was hostility in the Eastern press for the most part. But also sensationalism. This is the same time that various exposés were being published about what life was like in Utah, an escape from the Mormon harem, and things like that to rile up the reading public and get people wondering and questioning and condemning plural marriage out here.
I was just going to say really quick, well, isn't there also about this period of time a pushback from women in Utah defending the practice of plural marriage?
Yes, that there were several times where the women expressed themselves. So let me tell you, in the 1850s, early 1850s, there was a movement to give women the vote in Utah. And the Mormons were in complete agreement with that. Sure, why not? But the ones who were pushing it were positive. Well, if the women have the vote, they're going to vote to condemn polygamy. They will outlaw it, etc., and so forth. And the opposite happened. The women got the vote. Nothing was done about plural marriage in terms of territorial bills, condemning polygamy. And in fact, women expressed themselves in public meetings as well as in print, defending the principle of plural marriage. And so, needless to say, that was frustrating for those back in Washington, D.C., and elsewhere in the East, where they had figured, well, this will help get rid of Mormon polygamy. You have to keep in mind that the Republican Party, when it was founded in 1854, if I remember correctly, it was founded on getting rid of the two relics of barbarism, slavery and polygamy. So the Civil War and the aftermath, they got rid of slavery. So then the attention was placed on getting rid of that other relic of barbarism, polygamy. The 1880s were a very difficult time for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This was a time that was known as the Raid. And the reason why it was known as the Raid was because literally there were raids. There was a constant effort to arrest members of the church, polygamous men, as well as some women.
And members of the first presidency as well, right?
Yes. Well, all of the members of the church who were living plural marriage, but particularly members of the first presidency and Quorum of the 12. In fact, there was a wanted poster that was printed and sent out with a reward for the arrest of John Taylor or the arrest of George Q. Cannon. Joseph F. Smith wasn't on the wanted poster. He was kind of out of the picture. They had sent him away.
I think that the bounty for George Q. Cannon was higher than that for John Taylor.
It was, if I remember correctly, it was $300 for John Taylor and $500 for George Q. Cannon.
So why was it higher for the counselor instead of for the president?
Because there was a belief among non-members that George Q. Cannon was really the one running the church, that John Taylor was having health problems. John Taylor wasn't doing much. He was in hiding, but who knew how well or sick he was or whatever else. And so their aim was to really get George Q. Cannon, because they felt that he was the one really running the church.
Okay, I might be jumping ahead here, but didn't they get George Q. Cannon at one point? I've seen pictures of him in the striped jail suit.
Yes, right? Yes, they eventually did, and I'll get to that. But yes, so what really enabled the lawmen was two bills were passed, and each one was worse than the other. So in 1882, we had the Edmunds Act. And the act made polygamy a federal crime, leading to a large number of arrests and convictions for unlawful cohabitation. So let me explain unlawful cohabitation. They had outlawed bigamy, they had outlawed polygamy, but it was difficult to prove that there was a polygamous or a bigamous marriage involved because the marriages were not recorded like at the county recorder's office.
Okay, I'm feeling really dumb here, but can you tell me the difference between bigamy and polygamy as far as the law is concerned?
So, legally speaking, bigamy is when someone marries another spouse without the previous spouse knowing. So, they had to then get around that because members of the church would say, like a polygamous man would say, yeah, my other wives knew.
Yeah,
so,
that wouldn't hold much
right.
water, right?
So that didn't hold much water. So then they made polygamy illegal. But then they had to prove that this man was involved in polygamous marriages, and they couldn't because it wasn't recorded anywhere that lawmen could get to. I mean, obviously, it was being recorded, but they couldn't get access to those records. So, therefore, they came up with something else. They came up with unlawful cohabitation, meaning that a man was living with someone other than his wife. However, they really made the definition kind of wide, kind of loosey-goosey. If a man was seen going in and out of a house that wasn't his own house, then they could say, you are involved in unlawful cohabitation. No, I'm not. I'm just going in and out of the house. Yeah, we'll prove that in court. So it became really easy for them to basically throw charges out there of unlawful cohabitation and round up the men and take them to court. And it wasn't as easy for the men to say, well, no, I don't really have a connection to this house other than, they're a friend or they're part of our ward or whatever. Well, that woman doesn't have a husband, but she has kids. Therefore, you must be the husband and the father of the kids. Yeah, a lot of times that was true. Other times, well, maybe not, but it was very difficult to defend that. As I said, most of the time they couldn't prove polygamy, but they used unlawful cohabitation and really circumstantial evidence. So that made it difficult, but that wasn't bad enough. In 1887, we had the Edmunds-Tucker Act. Now, this act disincorporated the church, seized its assets exceeding a value of $50,000, and required an anti-polygamy oath for voters and public officials. Now, let me tell you about the anti-polygamy oath. And Idaho, they passed their own anti-polygamy oath bill that became law with an anti-polygamy oath that made it even more difficult. But basically, you didn't have to be a polygamist. If you believed that the teaching of plural marriage was true, you were not allowed to vote. So that made it even more difficult for members, even monogamists who were not living the principle. It made it difficult for them.
Just a quick question. Now, you're talking about whether the people believe or not. Can you give us a little bit of a compare to, like, at the time of Joseph Smith, when plural marriage was very first introduced and they believed that it was required by the Lord? What do you think the belief in general is amongst the people at this time? You've got all these laws being passed, but how do the people feel about it?
The people felt very strongly that it was a holy principle and that Joseph Smith had been inspired by God to introduce plural marriage. So it was a belief among the majority of the members of the church that it was a correct principle, even if they were not living it. Most of those members still believed that it was a true and correct principle. And if they admitted to that, then they were not allowed to vote.
So I'm going to imagine that during this period of time, it really isn't going to be about what they believe. It's going to, the more and more pressure that gets put on, it's going to be whether or not they have a choice at all, whether they just have to give this up because of the changing laws.
Yes, absolutely. Furthermore, this Edmunds-Tucker Act disenfranchised all women in Utah, so they had been given the vote. They had the vote up until 1887. Then it was taken away from them. The reason being is they didn't want any Mormons, as much as possible, to vote. And so they said, we're cutting out all the women. And as for the men, if you even hint at believing that this is a true, principle, a correct principle, then you can't vote either. So the only ones that were voting were the ones who either lied in the oath or who didn't believe that it was a correct principle and were hoping that the church would get rid of it. And those who didn't believe that it was a true principle in the church was a minority, a real small minority. So this, in a way, cut out most of the members of the church, one way or another, from being able to vote, from being able to express themselves.
So yes. Basically what we're saying is, at this point in time, politics became completely controlled by anti-Mormons.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yes. On the territorial level, on the city level, for the larger cities at least, yes, that it was non-Mormons or even those who were bitter toward the church that were in these different positions. And to top it all off, and I had said 50s for women. It was 1870 that they were given the vote. I was being a little too gung-ho on giving women their voting rights earlier. So that was earlier. Sorry about that. But I wanted to mention one other thing. Wives were required to testify against their husbands. By law, usually that was not the case. Wives were not forced to testify against their husbands and vice versa. However, the government got around this by saying, well, they're not really your wives. So they do have to testify. This is actually a great segue into another thing I was going to mention. So many people, so many men were being arrested and sent to the penitentiary that they were going into hiding and everything. It ended up around 1,300 men eventually served time in the territorial penitentiary. And most were convicted for unlawful cohabitation. But also some women were either put into the city jail or actually sent out to the penitentiary. And these were women who said, I absolutely refuse to testify, and you cannot make me do so. And they said, oh, yes, we can. We're going to lock you up in the penitentiary until you testify. And a couple of these women were there for a while until finally public sentiment was so offended by that, even among non-Mormons, that they were released. But that's how bad it got. So keep in mind all of this that's going on. There's families are being torn apart. People are being forced to go on the underground, as they called it. And that meant that they would either hide somewhere near the house, or sometimes They would go out of Utah Territory or to another part of Utah Territory, or the wives would be sent. My great-grandmother, the family lived in Ogden. She was sent up to Idaho a couple of times, hiding in Idaho, and I think one time down in Salt Lake area, south of Salt Lake, to trying to hide. And it was a rough time. And
it's not just the political pressure, it's the actual emotional stress of having to deal with this.
Great amount of stress. So families were torn apart. People were on edge, because lawmen would, if they got, a word from a snitch of some type that the guy was back visiting his family, they would barge in at any time, day or night, barge into the house and ransack a person's house and search all over. It was an incredibly difficult time. And by this point, all of the church leaders were in hiding. They had gone on the underground also. And so members began to complain. And I want to read an anonymous letter that was sent to President John Taylor. And you can give me your thoughts when I'm done reading it. It's interesting. President Taylor, dear brother, I write to you in kindly and brotherly love. You are hidden away and cannot know the true feelings of our people, and those that surround you are afraid to tell you if they know. There is a general murmur, a feeling of uncertainty that has not been manifested since the days of Nauvoo. The people say that you and Cannon and Smith have run away and left the masses to go to the penitentiary or humiliate themselves before the courts as they may. And if they take the latter course, you ostracize them like you have Sharp. Now, let me stop there very quickly. John Sharp was the bishop of Salt Lake City's 20th Ward. He was arrested in 1885, and he was, by this point, he was quite a bit older, not in great health. And so talking with his lawyers, he decided that what he would do was to go in, plead guilty, be fined, promise that he would not teach plural marriage and to no longer cohabit with his wives. He did that, and he was ostracized. He was released from his position as bishop of the 20th Ward. And for the listeners, I'm sure a number of you realize, but probably many of you don't. Back at that time, if someone was called to be a bishop, they were the bishop until they died. And so Sharp had been a bishop for a little over 20 years, if I remember correctly, by that point. Yeah.
So this is a huge dishonor.
And he was released and ostracized. And yes, it was obviously it was a dishonor. Yeah. Interestingly enough, John Sharp remained very faithful to the gospel the rest of his life. And in fact, when George Q. Cannon was arrested a couple of years later and went to court, he was released on bail, paid for by John Sharp and one or two other wealthy men in the city.
Wow.
And they paid the bail knowing that George Q. Cannon was going to jump bail. And he did. But was caught again.
So I'm seeing that we're not only now getting the pressure from the outside, but we're starting to have turmoil on the inside as well.
We're getting a lot of pressure from the inside. So I'll now continue the letter. I left off where it said, you ostracize them like you have Sharp. You will force men to go to the pen when you will not go yourselves. The murmurings go so far as to say, if Brother Brigham were with us, it would be otherwise, and wish for a man that could lead us out of the darkness. Why does not someone come to the front and save our people from division? If things continue in this way much longer, there will be more danger within than without the church. Something should be done. By your course, you are not uniting the people, but you are setting one part of the polygamists who want to obey the law of the land against those who will not obey them, but hide or go into court and swear falsely. You will do nothing for us. How in the name of God can you still claim to be a leader when you have ceased to be a leader, but instead become a divider? Why do you not do something for the people?
Wow.
Wow. That was a letter sent to the president of the church from a member. And that's just one example. There are other examples, but that's one of the more colorful examples. So it was a difficult time. Pressure from outside of the church, pressure from within the church. So John Taylor continued to be on the underground, and he eventually died. He died in 1887, July 1887, in Kaysville, in self-imposed exile, hiding on the underground.
Now,
And yeah,
I wanted to bring out at this point, they have the 1886, so you're talking 1887. We have that revelation that was just released in John Taylor's handwriting there. But again, things were in so much turmoil in the church right now. I don't think they were having conferences or anything like that.
No.
They've even been announced to anybody. So,
Right.
there's this circumstance here that's probably why it wasn't known at that time.
Right. Oh, yeah, definitely. And I think that has been explained in a couple of articles that part of the reason why the revelation that was received in September of 1886 and written down by John Taylor, the reason why it wasn't brought before the Quorum of the 12 for them to read it and to vote on it as to whether or not it was a revelation, to be accepted as a revelation, and then would have been sent to the body of the saints in a general conference. And the reason why that didn't happen was that everyone was on the underground. You get two or three of the brethren that might get together here and there, but they went a while without a full meeting of the Quorum of the 12 and the First Presidency, because everyone was in hiding.
Yeah, they're not going to even be able to meet again until after the Declaration number 1, right?
Yes, and they because John Taylor died and they needed to have a new president of the church, they actually risked arrest, and they gathered several times. First, just a few of them, and then as many as possible of the obviously the First Presidency had been disbanded when John Taylor died, and so they had been put back into the quorum of the now more than 12. But they did meet because they eventually had to have a First Presidency with Wilford Woodruff as president of the church. Now let me tell you about leading up to the Manifesto. We're finally getting to the official declaration number 1, the Manifesto. So all of this is going on. There are men and women being arrested. Families are still being disrupted and torn apart and in turmoil. There's a lot of problems with the attacks against the church. The government had their way to a degree in that very few plural marriages were being performed. So much persecution was going on. So many people were in hiding that plural marriages had decreased to almost none that were being performed leading up to the Manifesto. In fact, a circular had gone out basically discouraging any plural marriages being performed under the circumstances. And that had been for at least 6 or 7 months or so before the manifesto. So what the catalyst was for the manifesto was basically there were a couple of things. There was all of that going on, plus there was word received from Washington, D.C., that they were going to have even harsher legislation, where basically they were going to confiscate all church property, including the temples, and basically say that the church was no longer a legal organization. That was the rumor that Salt Lake, that leaders had received. Plus, there was a commission, and it was the Polygamy Commission, basically, where their job was to get reports. Are there any new polygamous marriages? How many polygamists are there? And they would send out reports every so often. Well, a new report was being prepared by the Polygamy Commission, and the Salt Lake Tribune got the information that what was going to be in the report. And then the Salt Lake Tribune was very anti-Mormon at the time, very anti-Mormon. I cannot emphasize that enough. And so they printed the report before it had been released, and it was a scathing report against the church. Wilford Woodruff and others, George Q. Cannon and some others, there had been talk and even attempts at having a kind of a manifesto, even back to September of 1886, before John Taylor received his revelation. So there had been attempts to basically have a manifesto saying, okay, we're not going to preach a plural marriage anymore, and we will not conduct new plural marriages, at least within any bounds of the United States. And so this had been talked about. It had been discussed, the pros, the cons, etc., and so forth. Well, when the Tribune printed these scathing reports, that's when they decided, okay, we've got to act, because all this is going to do is encourage them to create a new bill and vote on it that will basically make the church null and void, take all the property, including the temples. And Wilford Woodruff had been doing a lot of praying about, what do we do here? We cannot go on. And so what happened was, I have here, and this is from the First Presidency Office Journal for the 24th of September, 1890. In attendance were several men, and the journal also was based on Franklin D. Richards' diary, George Q. Cannon's diary, and Mariner Wood Merrill's diary. Now, Franklin Richards and Mariner Merrill were apostles, and of course, George Q. Cannon was counselor to Wilford Woodruff. Meeting of the First Presidency and Apostles held at the Gardo House at 2 p.m. Present, Presidents Wilford Woodruff, George Q. Cannon, and Joseph F. Smith. Apostles, Franklin D. Richards, Moses Thatcher, Mariner Wood Merrill. President Woodruff introduced the business of the meeting and submitted a telegram which had been prepared for publication to counteract the lying dispatches lately sent from this city, which pretended to publish extracts from the latest reports of the Utah Commission to the Secretary of the Interior. Elder George Reynolds read the proposed telegram. George Reynolds was the secretary to the First Presidency. The document was accepted by the brethren present, each one expressing his approval individually. The telegram is as follows and it is the manifesto as published as official declaration number 1. So after the document's acceptance by the brethren, they published it, they sent it as a telegram, and they published it, if I remember correctly, first in the Deseret News, and then it was picked up by other publications. And so that was the manifesto. That's how it came about. Now,
Are you going to talk about the vision that Wilford Woodruff had, that what would happen if he didn't?
I am.
Very good.
You are way ahead of me. Well, not too far. I was just about to
Very good. Yeah.
start
I
discussing
think
that.
that's really important.
Yes. The manifesto in and of itself was not a revelation.
Right.
The brethren at the time did not view it as a revelation. They viewed it as a statement to save the church, basically, because they felt, and I think rightfully so, that they were on the verge of basically being destroyed as a church, as a body. And so they did not view it as a revelation. However, Wilford Woodruff, and this was explained in General Conference, which came just a couple of weeks after this, Wilford Woodruff did see in vision, because he was doing a lot of praying and soul searching and asking God, what do we do? Where should we go next? How do we stand with this? Because of all of the persecution, it was coming to a head there. And he saw in vision that the church would be broken up completely. It would be disincorporated. The temples would be confiscated, and they would not be allowed to enter into the temples. All temple work would cease. It was a horrible mess. He saw that in vision, and he realized to save the church, to save temples and temple work, that this had to be done. And so that's how it came about. To which the Salt Lake Tribune, they of course attacked it completely.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I remember reading an article from the Salt Lake Tribune that said something like, this press dispatch that you released is not near strong enough. You need to encouch it as a revelation from God so the people will listen.
It did. Yes. That was their editorial, and they didn't believe it, and et cetera and so forth. So it was taken to the members of the General Conference. The General Conference was just a couple of weeks later, because this was September 24th. So just a couple of weeks later, about a week and a half, I guess. And it was taken before those present at the General Conference, and the revelation was read. In fact, I'm going to read this. This is from the Wilford Woodruff Papers Project, which is an ongoing project by the church that is similar to the Joseph Smith Papers Project, but obviously not as large as a project. But nevertheless, it's still a really good project, and they're doing good work.
Wilford Woodruff's journals are pretty large.
Yes. Wilford Woodruff, if ever there was someone who was OCD, it was Wilford Woodruff, and I'm so glad that he was. Because this guy recorded everything. His journals are a treasure trove. They are so fun to read. But anyway, we're really getting off there. Sorry.
Well, in another way, his contribution to history is unmatchable.
Oh, yeah. It's incredible. Just incredible. So here's what they wrote in the project. 10 days after the manifesto was released to the press, it was read in General Conference on October 6th, 1890. A vote was called to accept President Woodruff's declaration concerning plural marriages. Some of those present abstained from voting. I'll get back to that in a moment. But the remainder sustained their prophet's decision. George Q. Cannon then testified that the manifesto was from God and was supported by the apostles. He added that at no time before then had the Spirit, quote, seemed to indicate that this should be done, end quote. He continued, quote, we have waited for the Lord to move in the matter, end quote. He then asked the saints to do as their leaders had done and pray for their own confirmation that this was God's will. I firmly believe that under the circumstances, this was God's will. And now, interestingly enough, after the document's acceptance by the General Conference, the Salt Lake Herald, of which Heber J. Grant, who was an apostle at the time, was publisher, editorialized that the anti-Mormon Salt Lake Tribune, quote, pretends the declaration is a revelation, although no one today has heard anyone except the lying sheets say it was a revelation, end quote, from the Salt Lake Herald, 9th of October, 1890. So while the manifesto in and of itself was not a revelation, it was based on a vision that Wilford Woodruff received. It was based on serious prayer, fasting and prayer by the apostles, and they all agreed this was what they had to do to save the church. Now, back to the vote. It says that some of those present abstained. Some people have suggested that at least a quarter, maybe up to a third of the people there did not vote. They abstained. No one voted against it, but there were a number of people who were still, in a form of upheaval and still undecided. I think that after the fact, a number of them took George Q. Cannon's advice, and they prayed and received their own confirmation that that was what needed to be done to save the church. But here's what else Wilford Woodruff Papers Project wrote. Though some saints quickly found peace with the manifesto, many others felt betrayed and bewildered. In the past, Wilford Woodruff had repeatedly stated his belief that God would save the church from its enemies, the federal government among them, and that they would be allowed to live their religion, which included plural marriage, in peace. After 45 years of refusals to give in or compromise, it was hard for those inside and outside of the church to accept that the standoff was suddenly over. The saints wondered why they had fought so hard for so long that the church leaders were going to capitulate after all. Now, in preparation for this, I was doing a little bit more, just looking up some articles and things to refresh my memory. And I came upon an article that was published in Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought, back in 1970, actually, in which this guy, a historian, argued that the manifesto was a win for the Latter-day Saints. I thought, really? So I started reading his argument because I thought, well, this is interesting. And I had not come upon that before this time. And so, which kind of surprises me, to be honest, but I read it, and he argued.
We told you that Craig was somewhat of an expert in this area.
But he argued that the Poland Act, which was 1878 or 9, the Poland Act officially made polygamy illegal, and a couple of other things, that if the saints had said, okay, if they had capitulated, then that plural families, he argues that the government probably would have torn plural families apart, made it that the men could not, have anything to do with the other wives and children, and it would have been a disaster for Latter-day Saint families. But by continuing to disregard the legislation and being willing to suffer the way that they suffered during the 80s, which was just a horrible time for the church and its members, that by the time the manifesto came around, that technically the men who had plural wives were not supposed to be continuing to cohabit with their wives, etc. However, for the most part, the government, they basically just turned a blind eye to that because they thought, we got to win. It wasn't as much of a win as we wanted, but we got to win, so we're going to go with this. And so I can give you an example, a personal example. My grandmother was born in 1892 to the fifth wife. And when she was born, an arrest warrant was posted for my great-grandfather and an arrest warrant for my great-grandmother. My grandmother carefully went into hiding. My great-grandfather, he basically allowed himself to be arrested. And they went into the court, and I'm really putting it in my own words here, but the judge basically said, I have better things to do than this, and he threw it out. And after that, any children born to that my great-grandfather had fathered, nothing was done after that. So this guy argued that if the Latter-day Saints had capitulated early on, it would have been devastating for the families. But by 1890, the government just said, yeah, we'll take whatever win we got. And
we're tired of the fight a little bit, yeah.
Yeah. So that's where we're at with official declaration number 1, the manifesto. And I'm going to promise the viewers that we're not going to go as long with the other ones as we did with that. So while the manifesto in and of itself was not a revelation, it was based on revelation. Official declaration number 2, priesthood to all worthy males. So let me just explain a little bit in what led up to the official declaration in 1978. This revelation announced a revelation extending the priesthood to all worthy male members, regardless of race or color. Now, in terms of what led up to it, Spencer W. Kimball's son, Edward L. Ed Kimball, gave the following points. First, historians and other scholars began to provide research questioning the traditional idea that Joseph Smith taught priesthood exclusion and cast a shadow on the policy's purported scriptural justifications. They had documentation that some blacks had received the priesthood during the time of Joseph Smith. So they brought that out. They also showed that some blacks, some African Americans had not only received priesthood authority, they had performed missions, and a couple of them had actually gone into the temple, had been allowed to go into the temple to perform some of the ordinances like baptisms for the dead. Then there were, of course, the changing social attitudes of Americans that put pressure on the church. However, I'm going to come back to that about pressure on the church, because while there were aspects of pressure, and we could go into examples of social pressure, around the time of the revelation, there had not been a lot of pressure from the press or other sources. So while there was pressure, it wasn't at that time. However, there were a couple of other things. Requests for missionaries continued to come from individuals and groups in Africa, particularly Nigeria and Ghana. They had been asking since the early 1960s, and Saints, the book Saints, does a wonderful job of telling this story. So I would recommend, if you have not read or listened to Saints that was put out by the church, you need to. It's well worth.
Give us the volume on that one.
So volume 3. Volume 2 discusses the Manifesto. So I was getting it mixed up. Then also, church leaders, they ask themselves, so how can the church deny the gospel teaching to sincere seekers, especially those who had repeatedly been asking, please just send some missionaries to teach us? And then if they did send missionaries, and if they did get new members in those African nations, how would they function without the priesthood? So these had been questions they'd been asking. But what I think was one of the main catalysts, and according to Ed Kimball, he felt that way too, based on the conversations he had with his father, Spencer W. Kimball. The church's surging growth, membership growth in Brazil, and particularly the temple in Sao Paulo, Brazil, was nearing completion. And that particularly troubled President Kimball because of the large mixed race population in Brazil. For those who don't know, Brazil's population is very much a mixed race population, with natives from Brazil, with those of European ancestry, Africans, all intermingling, marriages, very much a mixed race situation down in Brazil. So President Kimball spent much time fasting and praying. He would go to the temple often, after work. He would go and spend hours in the temple praying. He then asked the first presidency to do the same. So the three of them had been going and praying and discussing what do we do, etc. So finally, they came to a point where they felt that they needed an answer. They felt good about what they were going to suggest, but they wanted the first presidency and Quorum of the 12 all to be on board. And so in their meeting of the two quorums, Quorum of the first presidency and Quorum of the 12, President Kimball asked them to come to the next meeting, that would be a week later, to do a lot of fasting and praying during the week, and then come to the meeting fasting and praying. And they did so, and it was at that time that they received an answer, and they felt very strongly a revelation on that. And President Gordon B. Hinckley, who was an apostle at the time, said, there was a little man filled with love, able to reach out to people. He was not the first to worry about the priesthood question, but he had the compassion to pursue it and a boldness that allowed him to act to get the revelation. Now, I want to mention one thing. I have heard some people say, well, they did that because they had got word that the Carter administration, because Jimmy Carter was the president of the United States at that time, that the Carter administration was going to really come down hard on the church and take away their nonprofit status, etc., and so forth. I'd heard that enough that I decided to ask a friend of mine, historian Matthew L. Harris, who is the author of Second Class Saints, which is a book that deals with the African Americans and the church. And Harris, at least I don't think he'll be offended. He's pretty open about this. He's no longer a member of the church, and by his own choice. And so it isn't like he's protecting the church to be saying this, but I had heard from a mutual friend that Matt had actually contacted President Carter. This was obviously a while ago, since he's now dead and was not in great shape for a couple of years before he died. But Matt had contacted President Carter and spoke with him and asked him about that. And Carter had responded that while he personally was offended with the church's position, that he felt that that was the church's business, and he had not requested and would have stopped any effort by any of the departments of the federal government to take away the nonprofit status or do anything else like that would have infringed upon their religious rights. And so he said, definitely no. I did not have that. My administration were not going to do anything like that. And I had already mentioned that around the time that the revelation was announced, previous to that, at least for the last several months or so, half year or so, it had been rather quiet in terms of negative press or social pressure to change the policy. And so this really came out of the blue for a lot of people. It surprised them when the announcement was made. And so that is what I have about the priesthood to all worthy males, 1978. I remember when it was announced, and yeah.
So you have pretty strong feelings on this. So give us your perspective.
I'll be glad to. As a member of the church, I did not completely understand this. It bothered me that blacks, African Americans, whatever you want to call them, Africans, could not have the priesthood, could not hold the priesthood. But you have to keep in mind, I was 18 when the revelation was announced. So I was looking at this as a teen. But I had done reading about it. I had wondered, and my approach was, I don't understand this. I don't particularly like it, but I am going to follow the brethren basically on this, because I'm not in a position to decide one way or the other. But I do remember that we had talked about, and we had been told in lessons and stuff, that all worthy males would eventually receive the priesthood. In other words, blacks would eventually have the priesthood because they were the only ones who did not have the priesthood. Even Fijians, who were as black as many Africans, they held the priesthood. So it was aimed at those of African ancestry. And so I figured, okay, I don't know when that's going to be, but when it's right, it'll be right, I guess. So when the announcement was made, I'm going to be very honest, I was thrilled. And I was at work, and a fellow member of the church came back from lunch, and he had the biggest grin on his face, and he told me what had happened, and I said, "Are you telling me the truth? That really happened?" And he said, "Yes." And we were thrilled. We were thrilled. However, I had been brought up in lessons and in talks over the pulpit that it was not only our right, it was our responsibility to get our own testimony on anything that was taught, including right from the president of the church. And so that night, when it was time for bed, I knelt down and I had a kind of an extra long session, you could say, praying. And basically, I basically said, I'm thrilled personally, but that doesn't matter. Is this really from you, God? Is this really supposed to be now and for everyone. And I had my own spiritual confirmation. I'll just put it at that it was correct and that it was time. And I am a firm believer that it was at the right time. And was thrilled that happened. And my mission, I served my mission in Belgium and France, and we didn't have a lot of baptisms there. But two of the people I baptized were two fine young men from Zaire, and it was a privilege to be involved in that.
Very good. Thank you very much for sharing your heart with that. And I think we're supposed to cover the articles of faith as well.
Yeah.
We are. And this will be quick. They're there. No, I'm kidding.
Well, we can't really get into the topics and doctrine of the articles of faith, but maybe just a little touch in history.
Yeah. So what we have is in 1842, John Wentworth, editor of the Chicago Democrat, who I might add was a very colorful individual. He was a newspaper man, a politician, a bit of a rabble rouser, but he wrote a letter to Joseph Smith and requested, in behalf of a friend of his, a George Barstow, who was writing a history of New Hampshire. He wanted Joseph Smith to write a sketch of the, quote, rise, progress, persecution, and faith of the Latter-day Saints, end quote. And Joseph Smith saw this as an opportunity to be able to present the church's history and doctrines from the church's point of view, rather than from a non-Mormon, or worse yet,
right,
an anti-Mormon.
right.
And so they wrote, Joseph composed, and others wrote for him, a long letter, including a list of 13 core doctrines, which came at the end of the letter. And they then published that in the Times and Seasons, which was a church-run newspaper there in Nauvoo. They published that in March of 1842. Ultimately, what Joseph sent was not published in the history of New Hampshire, so it's nice that they published it in the Times and Seasons, and the Articles of Faith were canonized in 1880. Elder L. Tom Perry stated in October 2013 General Conference, quote, the Articles of Faith supply us with key doctrines of the Restoration. Each article of faith adds unique value to our understanding of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And I'm just going to really quickly just mention a couple of things. We can spend a lot of time going over that, and I'm not going to. But it really does mention unique doctrines of the LDS Church. And here's just a couple of examples. Article number 2. We believe that men will be punished for their own sins and not for Adam's transgression. So between this statement and 2 Nephi chapter 2, verse 25, Adam fell that men might be, and men are, that they might have joy, turns original sin on its head. It shows that it is a wrong doctrine, and that this was, nothing catches God by surprise. And he didn't go, oh, shucky darn, Adam and Eve partook of the fruit. Now what are we going to do? That was as it was supposed to be. And thus, we are not going to pay for Adam's transgression, especially after the atoning sacrifice of our Savior Jesus Christ.
Well, and
then, yeah.
the caveat to that as well is that because we are not under Adam's transgression, that it declares the innocence of children. And so that children aren't sinful, and that they are taken into the celestial kingdom if they die before they're 8. This is, again, a corollary to Article of Faith number 2. That is
Yes.
absolutely incredibly. I mean, I would join the church for that by itself.
Yes, absolutely. the idea that little children are sinful at birth is just ridiculous. So, yeah. Then 7, we believe in the gift of tongues, prophecy, revelation, visions, healing, interpretation of tongues, and so forth. And we have people say, well, yeah, but we don't do gift of tongues, the type thing nowadays. So I wanted to just really quickly, there's a couple of different things dealing with tongues. One is glossolalia, which is speaking in an unintelligible, unknown language, also commonly referred to as babbling. And that's we believe that if they are speaking in a tongue that no one has heard, that they are speaking in the Adamic language, and then there has to be someone to interpret. And we have examples in church history of speaking in tongues, of singing in tongues, and people interpreting. And so we do have that in our history. But there's also xenoglossia, which is the ability to speak a real existing human language that the speaker has never learned. And I'll tell you right now, people ask, well, is that the case? Yeah, but show me examples. Well, we have thousands of examples around the world. You have people going into the missionary training center, be it in Provo or at one of the training centers around the world, learning foreign languages, and in a very short amount of time, they are able to communicate with people in those countries of those languages. And I'll tell you right now, I think it is nothing short of miraculous what we have there. And so I think we see examples all the time of xenoglossia. There's also interpretation of tongues. And again, we have plenty of examples. I am aware of examples of people I know, of examples of where they have been able to understand what another person was saying in a language that they should not have understood, but they did. And so that's another example. We could go on, but we've gone very long. Those are just some examples. I encourage you to go over the Articles of Faith again and just, yeah.
Before we quit, which is your favorite? A favorite. Of course I have a favorite, okay? So
I'm not surprised. What is it?
Yeah, well, it is kind of a tie between 9 and 10. 9 is, we believe, all that God has revealed, all that he does now reveal, and that he will yet reveal many great and important things.
That would be your favorite.
The kingdom of God.
Truth.
Yeah.
Aleph, Mem.
Yes, past, present, and future. Aleph, Mem, Tav is how you spell it in Hebrew, which Aleph is the first letter, Tav is the last letter, and Mem is the present. So it's the definition of truth in D&C 93. But also Article of Faith number 10. Oh my gosh. We believe in the literal gathering of Israel. It's for real that Zion, the New Jerusalem, will be built upon this, the American continent, and that Christ will reign personally upon the earth, and that the earth will be renewed and receive its paradisiacal glory.
I actually had both 9 and 10 down to talk about, but I thought, oh, we're running long. So you just did it for me.
let me say this too. I also think that Article of Faith number 10 is really what separates us prophetically from Christianity, from Judaism, who believes that there will be a Zion built on the American continent as well as in the old continent, and sorts the prophecies accordingly.
I think you got to jump in there and say, in one way, we're not separate from Christianity, but we are separate from creedal Christianity, meaning from the creeds of the Nicene Creed that kind of define Christianity in this mainstream thinking. And truthfully, I don't think that creedal Christianity is the pure Christianity, because
Right.
I think we are pure Christians and they are
They're creedal Christians.
creedal Christians is the best way to put it.
Yeah.
Meaning they lock themselves into the creeds that were established at the Council of Nicaea. And that's what defines the difference here, is that creedal Christianity is where mainstream Christianity is.
And
Yeah.
the idea is that all of prophecy is allocated over to Jerusalem in Christian prophecy. And we realize that there's actually two stages going on. We're just going to read Moses chapter 7, verse 62, one of my favorites. And righteousness will I send down out of heaven, and truth will I send forth out of the earth, to bear testimony of mine only begotten, his resurrection from the dead, yea, and also the resurrection of all men. And righteousness and truth will I cause to sweep the earth with the flood, to gather out mine elect from the four quarters of the earth unto a place which I shall prepare, a holy city, that my people may gird up their loins and be looking forth for the time of my coming. For there shall be my tabernacle, and it shall be called Zion, a new Jerusalem. And so Article of Faith number 10, to me, is just our hope.
With that, I do want to kind of give you a chance to do your closing statement quick, and we'll go from there.
I'm done.
You're done, okay?
Yeah.
Well, then I will jump in and say we just thank you so much, Craig, for indulging us with your information and your historical knowledge, and we're just glad to have you come in on our little program. And with that, I just want to say God bless, and till next time, right?